Hello, friends. Welcome back to Reiki Crossroads and Connections, an ongoing exploration of the principles and practices and pathways that help you to live a life that is grounded, spacious, and connected. And we're doing that through conversations with a Reiki teacher and the practitioners, purveyors, magicians, artists of a wide range of practices that have sometimes very mystical connections with the system of Reiki. Really glad to have you here. And this week's conversation is a little bit special. Firstly, it's the first one I've done in actual person instead of over Zoom. And it's with a person I'm really excited to introduce to you. Jonathan Petty is a musician, a composer, an astrologer, a writer, and he's my dad. And I'm really glad to be having this conversation. Welcome.
Well, I'm very glad too. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Yeah. So we've been visiting. I'm in his home in Pennsylvania. This is his really creative and beautiful studio where he writes. And we've been having really wonderful conversations about the connections between our lives and our interests. And this is actually the second interview that we've done this week. The first one is about our mutual love of gardening and is posted over on my gardening channel. And in that conversation, we really got to explore the healing and grounding aspects of gardening and the ways in which the physical, present sense physicality of gardening was a really beautiful counterbalance to my dad's life as a thinker, as a writer, as an artist. If you're interested in that subject, I'll put the link to that interview down below. You can go check it out. In this conversation, we get to talk from the other side of the balancing spectrum. We get to delve into the imagination. We get to delve into thoughts and explorations of art and the esoteric in some really exciting ways. And so let's get into it.
Very well.
So I mentioned that Jonathan is a musician, a composer, and an ethnomusicologist. And you've written a number of books and countless articles about music. But your latest book, The Astrological Music of Richard Wagner, is a special one. This is one that brings together aspects of your life that you haven't gotten to explore publicly before. And that, quite honestly, are really exciting for me to dive into and to learn more about your perspective on. So let me just share a little bit with our viewers about set the scene here, give a little context for this, and then I'll invite you to tell us a story. So grounding this back into the connections with Reiki, we often talk about the system of Reiki as a practice that helps us to feel our interconnection with life. And one of the things that happens, and I see this over and over in my own life and in my students and in people that I'm working with inside of this realm, that when we lean into a system of practice, any system of practice that brings to our conscious mind our connectedness with all of life, often we start to experience a series of synchronicities. We start to see patterns in our life. We start to see breadcrumbs and threads that are leading and guiding us in ways that perhaps we wonder if they're mere coincidence or if there might be something else under the surface happening. I see this happen over and over again, just even in the context of a Reiki class, these synchronicities that arise between the students in the class. And it's something that we can become more conscious of and we can follow and we can cultivate as part of our practice because it is a really powerful form of guidance and of collaboration between ourselves and the world. And synchronicities is really at the heart of this exploration between the connections between the music of Richard Wagner and astrology. And to get us kind of grounded in this work, I'd love for you to tell the story of how this realization of this connection between this particular musician and astrological forms came to you, because it is in itself a really beautiful example of synchronicity.
Well, thank you, Michaela. I'd like to begin by giving a little bit of biographical detail. I studied astrology in high school, and I enrolled in the Faculty of Astrological Studies, London. And so I was working very hard on astrological work. And I became an astrologer for about 10 years. I was a practicing astrologer. Mm-hmm. At the same time, in my youth, I attended for the first, I was fascinated with music, and so I was also pursuing music as a, hopefully as a profession. So at my first encounter with Wagner was going to a performance of his one of the ring cycle operas. Mm. For those who don't know anything about Wagner, he wrote a cycle of 4 what he called music dramas, in which he began, as he said to a friend in a letter, at the beginning of the world, and ended at its destruction, by which he meant the beginning of the mythical world. This was the world of Norse mythology, Germanic mythology. And I encountered in the first of the introductory opera a kind of music that I'd never heard before. It stimulated me and it touched my mind in places I didn't even know I had. So I became fascinated with and obsessed with this music. And I didn't understand it at all. I didn't understand how it had moved me so deeply. So in my early 20s, I was pursuing 2 different courses of development. One was studying music in order to understand music's effect on me, because all of music affects me in similar ways, but not as intensely, and astrology. When I was 22 years old, I reached a point where I was at a dead end, both with Wagner studies and with astrology. I was in a psychological or a spiritual dead end because I had reached the limit of my understanding of these 2 subjects. And these 2 subjects represented 2 different poles of my personality, and they wouldn't blend. And this caused me a lot of concern and worry. So I was in this state of anxious inability to find a path forward, when I found a book called The Secret Life of Plants. And that is another, I was reading that because of another interest of mine, of gardening. And I was reading at the point where I had reached chapter 2, which detailed the work of a research scientist named Marcel Vogel. And I remember that I was sitting in the laundromat, sitting in a chair reading this book, not about 10 feet from the swirling dryer, which was going round and round and round.
You were getting sleepy.
And I was getting sleepy, yeah. And I closed the book on a finger and began to think. And I thought, my goodness, Marcel Vogel, he lives in San Jose. I was in San Francisco at the time. He lives in San Jose. That's only a couple hours drive. I could go and visit him. That would be a wonderful thing to do. He could tell me all kinds of things that I'd never heard about or thought about. And the dryer stopped and the cycle was over, and I thought, nah. Who am I to disturb someone like Marcel Vogel? He's just I'm just a punk kid, with no status or anything else. And, why would he want to talk to me? So I gave up the idea. I just kind of put it in the back of my mind. About a week and a half later, I got a call from friends of mine from Orcas Island, Washington State. And this was Dr. Jerry Eisner and his wife, Marilyn. And they said, we'd like to come and stay with you for a couple of days. I hadn't seen these people for about a year, but we were very good friends. And, I said, sure, hey, great, it'd be great to see you. Why are you here? And they said, well, Jerry is interviewing a man named Marcel Vogel, who lives in San Jose. And he's interviewing Vogel for a article that he's writing for the Encyclopedia Britannica on non-orthodox healing practices. And yeah, and would you like to come along by any chance? And of course I immediately went into this our altered state, something like a mild hallucinogen, this kind of Twilight Zone state. I said, of course. So we ended up driving down to San Jose a couple of days later to interview Marcel Vogel. Well, Vogel put us out in the backyard, his beautiful garden backyard, and the interview proceeded. And I sat there in this state of altered consciousness, feeling this like something wonderful was going to happen, but I had no idea what. And so after a few, maybe a half an hour, we took a break from the interview, and Jerry and Marilyn went into the house to look at some of these wonderful inventions that Vogel was, the author of. And Vogel turned to me and said, "And what do you do, young man?" And I was completely tongue-tied. I was like, I was in such awe of what was happening to me that I couldn't get anything out.
Relatable.
Yeah, I couldn't get anything out. And so I finally squeaked something like, "Oh, I'm an astrologer." And he said, "Wait just a moment." And he got up.
Did his voice boom?
His voice boomed in my head. I don't know if it boomed in reality, but it certainly boomed in my head. He says, "Wait just a minute, young man." And he walks into his house, and he comes out with a book in his hand, and he hands me the book, and he says, "This will place you head and shoulders above all other astrologers." And I looked at it, and it was Alice Bailey's Esoteric Astrology.
Nice.
And I had never heard of Bailey or the book, and I said, "Thank you." And then the feeling of numinousness, of mystical awe, lessened and diminished and stopped. And I figured, well, this must be what I was waiting for. So the interview continued, and then we returned home. And I started reading this book, and I tell you, it was like I had no idea what this book was talking about. I'd never read anything like it, and I read it constantly. And the more I read it 3 times, and it's a big book, and the more I read it, the crazier it sounded. But then after I had read it for the 3rd time, I was asleep. I was in bed, and I couldn't get to sleep. Really, I was sort of in a daze, and I had a vision. It was this vision of this great circle of fire. It was like a circle of fire, and I kid you not, became 12 small fiery points on the circle, and it became something. I knew it was a zodiac. I knew that it was a zodiac. It didn't have planetary symbols on it, but it was a very primordial kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, I started visualizing musical keys settling down on the fiery points, and they were the keys like C major, D major, A major, E major, D flat major, and so on. And they arranged themselves in this pattern as the wheel kept turning. And I jumped out of bed. It almost went Yahoo! I don't think I actually
Eureka! I've got it.
Yeah, Eureka. I don't know. I might have gone, Yahoo or Eureka or not, but anyway, I felt that, and went to the piano, and Wagner's scores were on the piano, and I said, I thought, the Valkyries, B minor. It's got to be B minor. And I looked it up, and they were in B minor. And I looked it up. I said, Siegfried, it must be D major, and sure enough, it was D major, and so on. And Sieglinde, his mother, G major, and yes, it was G major. And I went through the whole thing all night long, just looking it out. And what the revelation was that this was that Wagner's music was a horoscope.
Yeah.
Basically, it was a horoscope. It had the same structure. It had the same poetic images attached to certain points on this circle, and it turned. And in music there is a factor called the circle of fifths, and the circle of fifths is the most natural arrangement. It's the way you tune a guitar or a violin. If you were tuning a violin, you would start on a G on the G string. That's the pitch G. Then you would tune the next string up to the pitch D, which is a fifth above G, and the next one A, which is a fifth above D, and the next one E, which is a fifth above A. So in other words, the tuning of a guitar or a stringed instrument obeys the acoustical laws of the circle of fifths. And so that was the revelation. It brought together not only two different intellectual areas, but it brought together those, the chasm in my life between two seemingly separate subjects, that I was pursuing, but had reached a roadblock in, both of which I reached a roadblock in. And the solution to that conundrum was to be found in Alice Bailey's book. And the reason is that she was using the same symbolism for the different signs as Wagner was using the same symbolism in his music dramas, and associating with these specific keys, poetic images associated with keys, poetic images associated with signs. So that was the connection, and it connected both the music and astrology, and healed a wound in my life.
And I would suggest that there was a third aspect of your life that synchronized in that moment. If you watch our other video on the gardening channel, you'll hear those same names of Jerry and Marilyn who brought you to gardening. And the reason you were reading The Secret Life of Trees was because of that connection to gardening. And so your life as a gardener was represented in that synchronicity as well. There's, just in hearing you share that story again, you've shared that story with me a number of times, but in this telling, you emphasized something that I haven't heard you emphasize before that was just really poignant to me. And that was this aspect of healing this discord between, this seeming divide between these two really important aspects of your life. And that is very much what I experienced and have talked about on this channel. In fact, the last Reiki Crossroads interview that I did with Sarah Rimmel, we talk about this quite a bit. This similar sense of being divided between my, passions for social justice leadership development that I was working in higher education for a number of years focused on, and then my life as an artist and a person interested in healing and in, psychology and in working spiritual practices as a form of healing, and that those felt like totally separate, that they couldn't be brought together. And, in doing this work with Heartscapes is where that divide in me got healed. So I love noticing that connection in our stories that I hadn't really pieced together before. So we see, just in this introductory story, that synchronicity is really a huge part of the thesis of this work, and that in this book you are walking us through a profound example of synchronicity happening in a way that's both very specific, right? This very specific connection between Wagner's work and astrology, which you go on to detail. He was not an astrologer. He did not have the context of astrology, as far as we know, in his conscious mind when he was writing his music, but there it is. So you detail this very specific example and really kind of walk through a proof of this being so. But I'd love to kind of take a step back and talk about the topic of synchronicity generally, because again, that really ties in quite well with the system of Reiki and is something that I observe quite a bit as a outcome, a beneficial outcome of practicing the system. And so in your book, you describe different ways in which we as individuals and a culture understand synchronicity, right? Mm-hmm. It's something that many of us observe happening, and how we interpret what synchronicity is, what is the mechanism behind it, what it means, what, if anything, it means in our life, varies dramatically from person to person. And how we relate to synchronicity in terms of what it actually is, entirely impacts whether or not we can consciously benefit from this phenomenon. So I'd love for you to tell us a bit about how you understand synchronicity and how you came to that conclusion.
Okay, well, at the time that I experienced this, I was not, I didn't know Jung, the works of Carl Jung,
yes,
which is where the name of synchronicity, the term synchronicity comes from. I didn't know as much about it as, of course, I later, came to know. But what I thought it was a miracle. Yeah. That was my technical term, was a miracle. But I'd like to open the topic of synchronicity by giving a quote from Edgar Allan Poe.
Please.
That I quote in my book. And Poe says this, quote, "There are few persons, even among the calmest of thinkers, who have not occasionally been startled into a vague yet thrilling half-credence in the supernatural by coincidences of so seemingly marvelous a character that as mere coincidences, the intellect has been unable to receive them."
Yeah.
So synchronicity is heralded, the fact of a synchronistic experience is heralded by a seemingly miraculous coincidence. Yeah. Not the coincidence of picking out the right pair of socks, or finding a sock that you'd lost under the bed, but a true, truly miraculous seeming event. And what Poe says here, occasionally been startled into a vague yet thrilling half credence in the supernatural. That is a marvelous description of my state of mind as I was being driven toward Marcel Vogel, and as I was in his garden, and as I was reading that book, Esoteric Astrology. So synchronicity announces itself by a tremendously unlikely set of coincidences. But the coincidences, furthermore, are not random or meaningless. They're highly meaningful. This coincidence of mine was highly meaningful. There was emotion attached to it, and that's another trademark of synchronicity, another fingerprint. The synchronistic experience is generated by emotion, and also very often by stress in a person's life. There was a example. Jung gave an example of synchronicity in the consulting room. A patient of his had reached a dead end in therapy, and it had given Jung a picture of a beetle that she had drawn after having had the beetle appear to her in a dream, and she said it was just like I don't know what kind of beetle it was. It was like a scarab, like an Egyptian, one of the Egyptian symbols of a beetle. And at that moment there was a knocking on the window. Knock, knock, knock. And behind Jung. And Jung turned around, opened the window, reached out, picked up something and handed it to her and said, "Like this." And it was a golden beetle, which was not particularly native to that part of Switzerland. So, and of course her therapy proceeded, the shock of having been brought up against this evidence that there is a connection between the dream that she had and everyday reality, which, the living beetle belonged to everyday reality, and the dream beetle belonged to her unconscious.
Yeah.
And that kind of experience led Jung to theorize that the psyche, the soul, is largely unconscious. We have a conscious part, and we think we know what we're doing, and we have a name, and we have a character, and so forth, and all of these are conscious to us. But then there are unconscious processes that the brain supervises, like our digestion and our physical body. And if you go farther, deeper, the body is embedded in the world, and the world, it's of the same substance of the world, but it's the body generates an energetic field. And so Jung postulated what he called it was the unus mundus, the unified world, or the collective unconscious.
Or Reiki.
Yeah. Say something about that.
Yeah, well, we had a really great conversation yesterday about, what is Reiki, and, the simple word is translated as spiritual energy. And the idea that, buoys that word is that it's the energy, the life force that animates and connects all of life. And that through that animation and connection is how we operate and how we experience our life. And we experience that life through layers of experience, layers of consciousness, layers of physical reality. And that's kind of distilled into the concept of Sanmitsu, the three mysteries, the three ways in which we experience the world, which is through our physical body, which is tangible, solid, sturdy, easily observable,
Yes.
Through the mind, which is intangible, ephemeral, difficult to observe, difficult to describe and define. And then the bridge between them, which is the energy or the voice or the breath, those three, voice, energy, and breath, kind of occupying the same realm as this semi-tangible, but also still very ephemeral aspect of our experience that travels through the subconscious and the conscious, the physical and the non-physical realm. And that by unifying those three essential ways in which we experience our life, the body, the mind, the voice or breath or energy, by unifying them, integrating them, and then operating our lives, moving through the world from that stance of unification, is how we essentially become enlightened, how we essentially become whole, fully at our capacity, fully resourced, fully in touch with the connections of the world, and then experience a number of phenomena like miraculous synchronicity, because we are at that point so well connected with all of the aspects of the world, including and especially the unseen ones.
Yes. That shows that the substance with which Reiki works is essentially identical to the collective unconscious, what Jung called the collective unconscious. I would like to add that this synchronicity, my own experience of it in this case, went farther than I've said so far, because I began to write a book on this topic of Wagner and his music and the musical keys and the zodiacal signs. And I got a draft of it finally, and what I was particularly determined to discover was, did Wagner know what he was doing? In other words, was he consciously creating a universe in which poetical images such as water, such as river, such as river daughter, the mermaid, such as spring, are all associated with E flat major, which falls on Pisces, on the zodiac, or the next sign over, Aries, which is fire. I mean, Pisces is water and Aries is fire. And the next key over is B flat. And so theoretically that would fall under the Aries sign. And in the ring, B flat is associated with a fiery dwarf called Alberic, with a region underground, which is a region of fire called Nibelheim, and with smiths that are pounding on fiery, their work using fire to forge metals and gems and magical objects.
Yeah.
Or the next fifth over, F major, he associates with the giants, which are earth, heavy earth. They pile up stones to make the castle of Valhalla, and they're characterized by desire. They want gold. They want treasure. Anyway, and that goes on, so that overall there are about 2,000 connections between the keys and the text of Wagner. Also wrote the text, the play or the poem. Mm-hmm. He wrote the poem too.
So you charted 2,000 connections between these two. Wow.
Yeah, and they're in this book. So the question then that I had was, did he know what he was doing? Was this something that he was trying to do? Was he using the zodiac as a template or as a model of the kind of musical universe that he was trying to create? And the answer, after I searched for thousands of pages of books, I searched through his wife's diaries, searched through his own diaries, I searched through his own writings, which were copious, theoretical writings, and I only found one place in all of that, one instance in which he mentioned astrology, and that was in a letter to a friend, in which he said, "Well, I must be." One would almost think, from my life that my sign, that the sign of Taurus, watched over me. But the problem was that he wasn't a Taurus, he was a Gemini. And so from this, I concluded that first, he knew about astrology, and second, he didn't know it very well. So the question of conscious intention in creating this musical universe, the cosmos, in which the poetic images of his text are associated with zodiacal signs through the circle of fifths, could not be intentional, could not have been consciously done. The other possibility was pure chance. It could have been just pure chance. But the thousands of examples that I have documented rule out chance entirely. It would take trillions to one, for this to, and there are no exceptions to it. It's so the third. I'm drawn to the third possibility, which is synchronicity.
Yeah.
This was his example of synchronicity, so that my synchronistic experience enabled me to probe into his synchronistic experience. So that connected me, my unconscious, to his unconscious. Mm-hmm. And then, now, whether that means that there's a realm of ghosts or spirits, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I certainly know, what I do know is that our lives are haunted, as it were, by our connections to other people. Yeah.
So there's a couple of things in there. I'd love to just kind of restate what I'm hearing you describe, because it took me a few, passes at this work and talking with you to really sink in the power of what you're describing here. You're describing a very complex system of practice that we know as astrology that maps these relationships between the physical universe, the stars and the planets and so on, and mystical experiences, poetic symbology, and then our daily life, right? How does that impact our daily life, right? Astrology, I'm probably oversimplifying the field of astrology, but this, complex system that has a very coherent structure that is envisioned to us as this wheel. And that is represented in the movement of the heavens, of the planets in the universe. So we have that structure. And then we have this artistic work by Wagner. And this is a story, this is a fictional story that connects Norse mythology with his own imagination, his time, his life, and whatever it was that he wanted to express as an artist in his time and place, his relationship to his audience, the people, generations later, like yourself, who would be impassionate about his work. And it follows the same structure. All right, so we have two structures that are not connected by consciousness. As you said, you did found no evidence that he was consciously aware of the complexity of the structure of astrology, nor was he consciously applying it to his work. And yet you've tracked 2,000 points of connection between these two very complicated structures, a piece of art and a system of thought that helps us to organize our relationship to the world. And there's no conscious connection between the two, and yet they overlay each other beautifully.
Yes, that proves to me the existence of a depth in our psyches that is in communication with each other, that we are essentially the same being on the unconscious level. Yeah. Not simply because we all have brains that are similar to each other, right, but because the mind extends outward and downward and upward into, past our physical bodies, yeah, and into the body of the world, yeah, Jung's unus mundus. What this reinforces is the fact that astrology is a psychological system. Mm. The inventors of astrology were probing into their own minds, and they were, in so doing, they discovered that there is a structure in the mind, in the human mind, which is like a zodiac. It's it's like a mandala in the mind, right? And it's there in all people, and it manifests. It's a way of organizing our experience of being alive, and when one works in a horoscope, one's own horoscope, works out one's own horoscope, one is probing into, where the interest is in the interesting points, whether stresses and strains, excuse me, whether stresses or strains or glories, interest, fascinations, catharses, right. Yeah. And so astrologers have practiced their craft for over 100 years, knowing that this was the case, that this, yeah, is a psychological system that they're working on. There is one other aspect, a further aspect to this phenomenon of the ring, that is cultural. One of the since the collective unconscious, it represents all people, is the structure of all people, then its effects are not just personal, but they're cultural as well. There is, for example, a spirit of the times. Yeah. We talk about a spirit of the times, or a Weltanschauung, a ghost of the present, that makes everybody behave in an intelligible way with, right, respect to each other. But the ring of the Nibelung, which is the work that I've dissected here, is in musical circles the greatest piece of music. Is widely thought to be the greatest piece of music ever written. And and there are thousands. I'm not the only Wagnerite. There's tens of thousands, and there have always been, thousands of people that are passionately. There are Wagner societies all over the world. His music was incredibly inspiring to composers of his contemporaries and those who came after him. So what I'm getting at is that this top subject of this particular synchronistic experience is a cultural a treasure.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just this astrological organization of his music is not just the organization of some hack piece of music,
Right.
but this is a cultural treasure. So this also brings to the surface the cultural aspect of synchronicity.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And there's a couple of threads that I want to pull here. So I'm going to take this one and set it aside. I'm going to come back to that one. The thread that, of culture and of Reiki and this work that we're talking about weaving together, where we have the perspectives of very different cultures, right? We have a very Eurocentric perspective working with Wagner, working with, astrology and the way that we understand it in the West. And this piece of art that comes from a European perspective, viewed from a European perspective as one of the greatest pieces of music. And then we have this Japanese system of practice that has its own cultural roots and its own origins and its own perspectives on greatness and on art and on synchronicity. And there's vast differences between those cultures and between the experiences of the people who come from those cultures. And yet there's also these points of connection. And so when you describe, astrology as a psychological system that allows us to probe, deep inside of ourselves and to see, aspects of ourselves projected out into the heavens, into, the heavenly bodies that we map with astrology, and to make meaning of our internal experience through the expression of this external, both mystical and physical reality of the planets, that there's this relationship and this flow of awareness from the very interior of ourselves, the very center of ourselves, out to the very edges of the universe. So from the smallest experience that we can have as an individual, our own self, our own center, and then the biggest experience that we can imagine, the universe. And we see that in the philosophical underpinnings of the system of Reiki, and we see it in a very simple but clear form in the practice of Joshin Kokyu-ho, which I've shared on this channel a number of times, which is a breathing meditation that has us draw our attention down into our hara, into the center of our belly, the first diamond, our origin point, where it's believed that the spark of our true self lives, the spark of connection between ourself and the rest of the world lives. And we concentrate our attention in that spark. We come into our most centered place. And then we imagine that spark expanding in all directions and continuing to expand once we've practiced and we can keep our attention focused well enough. We can imagine that spark expanding all the way out to the edges of the universe and being on the way as it expands, being in relationship with everything that it touches, with every piece of life, with every stone, with every planet, all the way out to the very edge of the universe, and then continuing to expand at the same rate that the universe is expanding. And this imagery is, and the purpose of practicing this guided imagery is very similar to what you're describing in the practice of astrology, coming into our center in a very concentrated way, in a way that's very personal, and then holding that personal experience, that relative reality of our own psyche, our own life, and then expanding that into the ultimate reality of everything, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so there's this beautiful mirroring of concept and a very clear understanding that it benefits us greatly to make this connection, right? That this isn't just something that's just true in the background of our lives, that there's great benefit to us to spend time and energy. And, for many of us, in your case with the work you do, in my case with Reiki, many decades, working this material, there's great benefit to us in bringing together these realms of the highly personal, highly concentrated, and the universal in our conscious life and in our day-to-day life, really. The thread that I said over here that I just wanted to mention is that something you said earlier where you're like, I don't know if there's ghosts or if there's, what is the mechanism of the synchronicity? And I wanted to highlight that because it's one of these examples where it doesn't really matter what the mechanism is. It could be interesting and it could be enlightening, and we can have moments where we, have an experience where we, come to form some sort of belief about what we believe the mechanism is. I've had those experiences with Reiki. But ultimately, observing the experience of the thing is what impacts our life, regardless of what the mechanism is. We can be enriched by having a belief or an understanding, a perspective, an insight, maybe even a really powerful magical experience that guides our attention to something that we might call the mechanism, right? What is it that's actually causing this to happen? But ultimately, that's much less important than being in it, living it, experiencing it in our life. And that actually kind of brings us to where I'd love for us to land here in this conversation. We could talk for hours and hours and hours about the content of this book. But instead, I'm going to invite all of you to pick up this book. And if any of this is touching some point of curiosity or insight for you, to dive into this really magnificent exploration of this very specific and very beautiful example of synchronicity in art and in our life. But what I'd love for us to land on today in this conversation is, what does this have to do with our life? Why does this matter to our day-to-day life? Which is a question that I often pose. All of this is super interesting to think about, but when it comes down to our daily life, why does this matter? And so if we think about, our opening conversation about synchronicity, and that we can regard synchronicity as pure coincidence and just kind of move on with our life, or we can view it as something representing something unseen that we're not aware of. What would you say is the value to the average person, or the person who is interested in these matters, to paying more attention to synchronicity in their life? Mm-hmm. And related to that, is there a way that we can increase the happenstance of synchronicity in our life, or maybe increase our awareness or even our noticing of synchronicity in our life?
Yes. Synchronicity, or let's say these, rather call it meaningful coincidences, are always going on around us. They're going around us at all times. We have not, in our society, in our particular culture, been trained to notice them, to respect them, to open ourselves to them. All too often, when one shares a profoundly meaningful coincidence with someone else, a friend or someone else, they will reply, "Well, that's just coincidence," which is to say, there's no meaning there. To say, coincidence is synchronicity without any meaning. Mm. And so it's been my experience, and it's the experience of countless others, that the way to encourage these experiences and these guidance, these points of guidance, they're points, sometimes they appear and they will guide you in, toward this or that decision to make, when, in and not a colossal or stupendous context, but just in an everyday, ordinary context. The best way to honor these experiences and to encourage them to grow in one's life is to honor one's self, and to practice self-awareness disciplines. In my case, it was astrology and music too, which is mystical. But Reiki, for example, is one way to take seriously these systems, and find out about them, read about them, contact practitioners that, particularly when it means something to you already. Yeah. When you're in a state of stress or a state of doubt or a state of quandary, then, you in consulting others, it could be therapist, your priest, your pastor, your rabbi, then you are honoring yourself, and what will happen is that the universe will answer you. You're not alone. You're not alone. There, you are embedded in something, in a tremendous reality that means everything. Yeah. It means everything to you, and it's our life. Synchronicity is just one of the many manifestations of life, of spiritual life, of sacred life. It's one of the ways in which the universe rewards paying attention. Jung said that the more you pay attention to the unconscious, the more it'll pay attention to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's possible to blot these out and to disown them and not experience them.
Right.
But then when you do experience them, you have this certainty.
Yeah.
about it in the heart.
That feels so connected to the work that I've done on intuition, right? Which feels like an important player in this conversation that we haven't named yet, but this phenomenon that each of us has the ability to experience, and many of us have in many ways, of this alchemy of our, what we actually know consciously, what we do not know and don't have access to knowing, our physical senses, and the unknown, the unconscious. It's this collaboration between our conscious, our unconscious, our bodies, and the world, is how I always think about intuition. And I've taught a lot about intuition because it's one of the reasons that I started practicing Reiki, is that I realized that I had shut down my intuition in the way that you were just describing, where we don't acknowledge these synchronicities. We don't look at the breadcrumbs and we don't follow them. We disregard them. Or maybe we're afraid of them and we choose to turn away from them. And then our the universe stops replying in these beautiful ways. And then we can also, cause illness by just not responding to what we feel is true. And so there's this aspect, what are the qualities, right, that we need to cultivate? And, when I think about your original story of how you went from this block, right, the stress of this, coming to a roadblock in your studies of Wagner and your studies of astrology, and feeling that they were feeling there was some connection, but not being aware of it, the happenstance of reading this book because of your gardener friends, the happenstance of this person's name being mentioned, and then, and the feeling, the sensation that you described of this otherworldly, something in your body and in your mind was telling you there's something to pay attention to here. Mm-hmm. And it cultivated a curiosity and a persistence, right? Because at that point of frustration, oftentimes when we hit the discomfort of frustration, we turn away from the thing, right? The discomfort can be too much, but instead you turned towards it with curiosity and with persistence, and okay, there's some sensation I'm having in my body that's telling me, pay attention to this name that shows up randomly in this book. And then, oh, there it is from my friends. Okay, yep, I'm going to go on that journey with them. And then, okay, I don't know what's happening in this interview, but something is here for me. So I'm going to be curious. I'm going to be persistent, even though I don't know what it is yet. This astrology book, don't know what this is about. Doesn't make any sense to me, but there's still something here. There's this aspect of following cues that come from inside of us, a sensation of some kind. I talk about that as the language of our intuition. Part of the work that I do with intuition is learning to understand the way that our intuition talks to us. It has a particular quality for each of us, so that we can recognize when that voice is speaking and saying, hey, pay attention to this thing. You don't know what it is yet, right? If you get frustrated about it, if you feel you need to know before your time, you're going to miss the next step, right? And so you have to stay open, curious, persistent. There's this, if we try to attach and if we try to cling on to those signs too strongly, we're going to miss the next one potentially. And so, yeah, I think for our daily life, what matters about this and how we can really integrate these ideas and be inspired by this incredible example in our daily life is, beginning by cultivating our curiosity, our persistence, our ability to be open and unattached, cultivate our intuition, and cultivate our willingness to believe that something is happening that we're not yet aware of it, but it matters to us. We don't have to always know, right? We want to cling so tightly to what we know, and we want the answers. And let me speak for myself. I have always wanted to know the answers. And it's been part of my practice to learn to let that go, to do, as Rilke says, to live the questions. And then perhaps in some distant day, we will live into the answer. And your story is such a beautiful example of living into an answer that really mattered to you and that has led essentially to your life's work. Represented in this book, and you started to mention previous books. There's threads of this work in some of his other music focused work, but in this one you really let yourself pull all of the threads together and express what has been journeying with you for a really long time.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's exciting to me as a person who feels very aligned with these concepts, and as your kid who's gotten to walk some of this path with you, mostly not knowing, right? It's only been as an adult that I've really gotten to understand what you've been up to in the world. And really, since I've been practicing Reiki, that I've been able to understand it from a personal level and from a experiential level and from the perspective of why this matters in our life.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So friends, I'm sure there has been something in this conversation that has sparked your curiosity, that has niggled something in the back of your mind, perhaps a memory of a synchronicity you've experienced, something that has heart and meaning for you about this topic. Perhaps you are a Wagner enthusiast and are really excited to learn this other dimension of Wagner's work, or perhaps you're an astrologer and are inspired by the way in which astrology imprints in our psyche in ways that we're not always aware of, but that can express in really magical ways. We would love to hear your experiences, your questions, and I invite you to pick up a copy of this book. The link for ordering it will be down below so that you can dive into this really beautiful examination. And as you do, as you cultivate your intuition, as you look for synchronicities in your life, may you be deeply provisioned for that journey. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, we love you. Bye.